Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Why I will never explore an abandoned house ever again. Most scary and horror stories from Reddit Nosleep. I just want to start by saying that this was my very misguided idea. I regret it immensely and feel terrible for bringing my friends into it. You don't need to tell me how stupid I was because I am very much aware. In 2010, when I was 15, I became interested in urban exploration photography. I absolutely loved seeing beautiful, eerie photos of abandoned shopping centers and hearing about all the awesome vintage stuff people would find at these places. I was originally thinking of going to famous local urban exploration sites, like a very well-known abandoned mental asylum called Larundel Mental Asylum. There are many creepy and weird pictures of this place online, and many stories of paranormal stuff happening there. About a week before my best friend, A, her boyfriend, G, and I were going to go, I got talking to an acquaintance, S, at a party who warned me off. She told me about how she and her cousins went there a while back. They were all very into spiritual/supernatural stuff, I believe. Nobody else was there that night except them, and apparently, they got horrible vibes as soon as they walked in. While they were exploring upstairs, one of her cousins felt an overwhelming force pulling him towards a room, and just before he opened the door, he fell on the floor and slashed one of his wrists so badly he nearly bled out. She said she would never go back or to anywhere like that again, but if I ever found a cool house to let her know. So, I was like, hell no, not going. I mostly gave up on the idea and just didn't think about it for ages until I found the house. So, I went for a bike ride one day a few months after this and decided to take a different route to my normal one and ended up running through this weird little pathway at the bottom of a dead-end street and kept riding until I ended up at this park. I had never been there before and was genuinely disorientated at this point. Like I was basically lost in my own suburb more or less. Anyway, I ride through this park to try and find a water fountain and end up going down this long path which led to nothing except this really high, stone wall covered in dead vines. The stonework on the wall was a really unique design, and it just seemed really odd and out of place, so I felt this urge to look over it. I stood on my bike and even then was only just able to look over this wall, and I'm not short. What I saw was a very, very weird mansion. The garden was absolutely overgrown, a sea of green broken only by Greek marble statues poking out, and the house was yellow. And the bottom floor windows were all broken, but I could see that black and white checker, parquet, flooring and more statues inside. The windows on the top floor were boarded up except for one that had curtains. There was also a fountain in the garden that was all cracked too. It was the oddest and most out-of-place house I'd ever seen, and my instant urge was to photograph it, but I didn't have a camera or my phone. So, I rode back through the park and picked a house number to remember and managed to make my way home even though I got really, really lost. I instantly messaged A and G and S, the girl I met at that party. I told them I found this incredible abandoned house and we need to check it out ASAP. My best friend immediately got super excited because the plan was we were going to start a blog and she would write about places we explored, I would take the photos, and her boyfriend was excited because he is super into horror movies and wanted to film stuff. S was a bit reluctant. She said the statues sounded kind of creepy, but eventually decided she would come. So, we made a plan to go on Saturday night, because G wants to film at night, and we're all scared of being seen by people in the park, so it seems logical. We'd meet at A's house, and G would borrow his dad's trailer to bring a ladder so we could get over the wall. So, Saturday night rolls around. At this point, I was nervous because it hit me we were breaking in/trespassing, and if we got caught my parents would flip out and never let me go out again ever. But I ended up at A's, S arrived, and G arrived. We ordered a pizza and drank some beer and hung out for about an hour because we decided to leave the house at midnight. It was weird because it should have been awkward, A and S were only sort of friends. S and I barely knew each other, and S and G had never met, plus G was older and hanging out with a bunch of 15-year-old girls, and yet we were all just so mutually excited/nervous that it was really cool. I remember distinctly thinking how the four of us were going to be best friends and do this all the time, and how cool the blog would be, and already planning where to go next. So we left at 12 and made it smoothly to the house number I'd remembered, and G parked the ute, and then this is where we encountered the first problem, because I led us down the wrong street, and it took about half an hour to find the park, and G was carrying this heavy ladder and getting really pissed off. So, we finally found the park, and I just remember feeling a bit uneasy. It was very, very dark. No lights in the park or streetlights were on, and it was really sort of still and quiet. So, we started walking. I was leading the way and not even sure that I was going the right way. The park had a really unpleasant vibe at night. It was odd in the day, but something just felt really isolated at night. So, we find the path and walk down, and sure enough, we reach the wall. We were ages away from the car. I had assumed it was quick, but I'd been cycling the last time and not carrying a ladder and a camera. So, once we reach the wall, G starts getting excited. A is nervous but pumped, so am I. S is uncomfortable. She goes, "I have a bad feeling about this," the minute we reached the wall. G climbed up and looked over and shined his torch and freaked out, saying, "Jesus, those statues are creepy." He sits on the wall, and A goes up, then me, then S. We're all sitting on the wall looking down at this sea of weeds and statues. S looked at me and shook her head. "I don't want to do this," she said, and I said, "You can wait here." She was too scared to wait, so we pulled the ladder up and climbed down it. As soon as we set foot in this garden, I was just filled with dread. I think we all were. The statues were very creepy and human-like. Up close their faces were simply wrong-looking, like features were weird sizes, and they looked really unsettling, like their arms were twisted weirdly. We were completely silent. G is filming, and I'm taking pictures. We reached the back door, and it's unlocked. Go, that's weird, and we all nod. Once we step inside, we're in this huge, empty room filled with objects, clearly statues, covered in sheets. G pulls a sheet off one and we all scream. It's a Greek statue with a horrible, human-like face painted on, grimacing. "Let's get the hell out of here," A says. We realize S has stopped in the doorway. "I have never felt such bad omens. We need to leave," she said. I walked over to her, but G was like, "No, this is creepy, but it's probably some local kids, blah blah blah, it's a safe suburb, also my film etc., and says he's staying." I was too scared to walk back through the garden/park without him, so we stayed. S is silently crying at this point. I felt like my heart was going to explode. So, we keep walking through the house. I'm shaking too much to take pictures. We pass empty room after empty room, all filled with sheet-covered statues. We reach the bottom of a marble staircase. S is shaking, A is squeezing my hand so hard it hurts, and G even seems hesitant, but we start walking up. Once we get to the top, it's clear something is very, very wrong with this house. There are no doors except one at the end of a hallway, but every room is filled with odd, wrong-looking furniture. Chairs painted red in a pile in one room, tables that are too high, painted odd colors. Something was really off. We open a cupboard in one room and scream at a horrific life-sized mural of some sort of bizarre person with inhumanly long teeth and hands. At this point, even G was freaking out. He was like, "Let's just check the last room and then get the freaking hell out." So, we all walked slowly towards the door. Inside was a nursery. A black crib, old wooden toys. I can't recall what they were, but maybe puppets. And strange paintings of clowns, I think, or maybe more akin to the mural of that person/thing, on the walls. We didn't even step inside. G said, "Let's go right now, this place isn't safe," and we headed downstairs. As soon as we get down we all freeze because some of the statues have been moved up against one wall. We dropped our stuff and ran to the door. G kicks it open and we run through this horrible garden to the wall. I remember when I was nearly at the wall, S just screams, and we all turn to see a light is now on in the nursery room. We literally scale this wall, jumping down and leaving the ladder. I sprain my ankle but don't look back as we all run through the park. We got in the car, and we're all crying and covered in cuts and scratches and my ankle is swelling already. G gets to S's house to drop her off and just says, "We're never doing that again," and then nobody says anything. He dropped me off next, then they left. I had to sneak in through the back door, so my parents didn't see me and freaked out. S deleted us all off Facebook that night and I never saw her again. I had horrible nightmares for a month afterward and my ankle has never been the same. I didn't tell anybody about what, and neither did A. We're still best friends but we never talk about it. Her and G broke up not long after the event. Honestly, I feel like we were in the presence of someone or something very, very evil. So, today G located and went back to the house and found out stuff/took photos. I messaged A and told her about it, and that I really wanted to find out more about the place despite my lingering fears after that night. She was absolutely like, "Hell no, I want nothing to do with this, do not go there." So, I found G on Facebook and messaged him about it, and basically saying, "Do you want to go back this weekend, during the day and check out the house?" He got so excited and said he had been thinking about going back and was willing to try and find this place today, without me as I was working, and also wasn't sure how I felt about going back. He said he would try and take photos, and so we used our combined memories of where the park was to direct him to the house. So, this morning he drove an hour, to the area where the house was and called me to tell me everything that happened as he was making his way home. So, first of all, he said the whole park is really different now, and there is a huge playground and picnic area and heaps of people around. The park is also much bigger and now runs alongside the house as well as behind it. When he found the house he was shocked to see a couple living there now. The stone wall used to surround the house is completely gone, and there's a wire fence, which literally is all that separates the house from the park now, and a tennis court has been built behind the house, which was where the back garden was. The house/garden itself is quite different. Because of the tennis court, the actual garden is tiny now, and it seems they demolished the back rooms and built a small outdoor area thing. I noticed in his pictures it seems they used the checkerboard flooring to tile the outdoor area. There are still some statues it seems, and the house is still yellow. G was able to walk around to the front of the house. He got one photo of this before he was noticed by a woman who was gardening in the front garden. So, to save his own but G called out hello and then went on to say he likes the house, but he thought it was abandoned and managed to get her to talk and found out the following information from her. She said they, I assume, they means her and her partner, only bought the house 5 years ago. Apparently, it was built in the 70s, this surprised me, I would have guessed it was older, by a very wealthy family from overseas who were planning to move over here but never did, and then it was empty for about 10 years. While they were looking to buy the place, their realtor told them a family lived there for a year in the late 80s but moved away and tried to sell it for years but couldn't, so it was empty until this couple saw it and fell in love with it because it was super unique, and then proceeded to renovate it. G then asked the woman about the statues, and she said they were from the original place, but she only kept some because a lot of them were creepy, in her words. He asked her if they kept anything else cool that was there when they bought it, and she said they had found a lot of bizarre furniture in the house which they had gotten rid of straight away, and G said she seemed a bit disturbed by the question. He then asked her, very forwardly, if anything creepy/supernatural had happened in the house, and apparently she sort of laughed and said no, but seemed really evasive and was clearly not telling him something and kept looking up at the front window during this part of their conversation. He said he absolutely thought she was really uneasy/was acting like she was being watched even. He asked if she had kids, why he did this, making conversation apparently, he really isn't subtle, and she suddenly seemed really upset and became very cold towards him, and said it was none of his business, which is fair enough, and when he asked if he could take photos/look around she said no and watched him walk away for ages like he looked back and she was still watching him. He ducked behind a tree and looked back, and she stood there staring for like 5 minutes before hurrying back into the house. His theory on the kid reaction is maybe they had a child, and it died? And he thinks the nursery we saw is related/relevant to this. He also said he's just so sure some weird stuff must have gone down in that house from the way she was acting. He said even though it was renovated, broad daylight and there were people around the park that he felt incredibly uncomfortable being near the house and it still gave him a really deep sense of dread, especially approaching the statues for photos. He said they were definitely the same make as the night, but not twisted and wrong looking like the night, though some he couldn't see their faces, and that something was really off about the woman and the house. He said he didn't even want to look at the photos to send them to me because he was so on edge about it and him really hated being there. He messaged me not long ago and was like, man, I'm so scared I'm going to sleep with the light on tonight and has been on edge and jumpy since going there, and that he regrets it. I haven't told A about any of this yet. So, I feel really odd right now. On the one hand, I feel better that the house is inhabited now, and has been renovated. Knowing those horrible statues and paintings are gone, more or less, is calming, but on the other hand, there's still so much we don't know about it, and writing about this/finding out more has really made me want answers, like who was it who built this house and why did they never live there? It seems very odd to me that you would spend a lot of money building this big house and then just not live there. Like something big must have happened. The oddest thing is that a family lived there for a year and then left. I find that very strange and it clearly indicates something happened that was so bad they moved somewhere else even though the house didn't sell for decades. Like if they had kids maybe that's related? It would be bizarre for the family to have left behind all of the really disturbing art/statues in the house. If it was them they must have been absolutely bizarre and possibly dangerous people, but if it wasn't them, I guess maybe it was a squatter who had unbelievably bad mental health problems. The nursery is even worse to think about now. Like I really hope wasn't raised in that house by an absolute psycho, and that the family left the crib and then it was painted black/the room was decorated so horrifically by some random crazy person or something. That room truly seemed demonic that night. So, after G visiting the house yesterday, I was way too scared to go to the house and speak to the woman, as the thought of going there makes me feel physically ill. So, I decided I would go today, my day off, alone, and see if I could get any information about the house from a neighbor. I knocked on 4 doors opposite the house and the only person who answered was one elderly woman, J. I told her I was authoring an article about the house and was wondering if she had time to chat about the house and anything she knew about its history, including the supernatural. She said she might be able to help me and invited me in for coffee. Jay was highly informative and keen to help me. Here's the gist of what she said. She moved into her house in 1982, with her husband who passed away 2 years later. She had always found the house very odd. It had a dilapidated for sale sign in its yard from the day she moved in. She never had anything to do with the place until Carol and John Kenny, a young wealthy married couple in their late 20s, moved into the mansion in 1987 from Brisbane for John's work. Carol was pregnant. Jay said she was very lonely since her husband had died and their sons lived in Sydney, so she became remarkably close with the young couple. She would often cook meals for them and bring them over and give Carol pregnancy advice. Jay only went inside the house a few times and said she found it dark and unpleasant and that mostly Carol would come over to her place for tea and biscuits. Jay said that a few months after living there, Carol, who didn't work and didn't have friends or family in Melbourne, confided in her that she hated the house and wanted to move back to Brisbane. It was big and hard to keep clean and her husband was never home, and she felt uneasy being there alone. She found a horrible mural in a cupboard, which we saw at night, and even though her husband had painted over it she hated being in that room, and was very disturbed because she had no idea who would have painted it. She also hated the statues, which had been there when they moved in. Her husband had moved them all into the garage and covered them with sheets, because Carol hated them. He insisted they must be antique and planned to sell them. Apparently, after telling all this to Jay, Carol became distant, didn't come over as much and sometimes didn't answer the door when Jay knocked. Jay suspected Carol and started drinking during the day, as she often reeked of whiskey the few times Carol would see her. Carol's husband came to visit Jay a few days before their baby was born. He seemed upset. Apparently, Carol was, in his words, acting very strange and seemed depressed. She had no interest in the baby anymore. He asked if Jay would go over the next day and help Carol set up the nursery. When Jay went over, bringing the crib her boys had used, she found Carol was in a terrible state. She looked unkempt and seemed incredibly on edge. She wouldn't tell Jay what was wrong until Jay suggested they head upstairs to decorate the nursery, and Carol burst into tears. She said she didn't want to go up there. Eventually, she told Jay that the paint in the cupboard had been scraped away to reveal the mural. Jay went up and saw this with her own eyes. Carol said John thought she was going crazy and that she had done this herself for attention. Jay was horrified to see Carol so upset, but said she herself questioned Carol's mental health at the time and feared for the child. That night Carol went into labor. John called Jay to tell her, and she visited them in the hospital. She never heard from them again. She went over to the house a week later, but nobody answered the door. She called and called, but nobody picked up the phone. A few months later, she saw a for sale sign in the front yard. She contacted the local realtor, who said he couldn't reveal personal information but that the house was up for sale and at that time unoccupied. They had only lived there for about 7 months. Jay never heard anything from them again. However, about 6 months after they disappeared, she found a haunting picture of a Greek statue in her mailbox, which seemed to have been cut out from a book or magazine, which, despite finding the image unpleasant, she kept pictured. She also showed me a photo of the original stone wall before the park was expanded, which her son had taken when he was visiting her. Jay said she heard noises and had seen figures in the front window of the house and called the police numerous times to report squatters, but it was always empty, and according to the police, just a bunch of statues. Jay felt very uneasy and said she believed the house was dangerous and regretted not doing more to help Carol. I asked her about the new residents. She said a new wealthy couple had moved in, but she'd kept her distance from them, as the few times she'd brought over baked goods to greet them they seemed cold and uninterested. I asked her if they had kids, and she said when they first moved in she'd seen the woman jogging with a pram in the mornings but hadn't seen the pram or evidence of a child in years now. She gave me permission to use these photos for my story. I found this very upsetting. What Carol went through sounds horrible. Jay's story confirms that the mural and statues were there before the Kennys lived there, which means either the people who built the house painted the mural or somebody/something did it and put the statues there during the period where it was empty, and possibly returned after the Kennys disappeared. I just hope their kid was okay and that the new couple's kid, if it was theirs, maybe they were babysitting, is safe. Weird stuff has been happening. I tried to find out anything I could about the Kenny family but found absolutely nothing. I sort of gave up on any further investigation until last night when something odd happened. I got a call from Jay. I left my number with her in case she remembered anything else worth telling me. She sounded incredibly panicky. Apparently, after I left her place, she decided to go over to the house and visit the woman who lived there, because she felt very, very guilty after thinking about Carol and how she didn't do more to help her. So, she went over and knocked, but there was no answer until finally, this woman opens the door. Jay said she looked bizarre, like she was wearing a lot of makeup on her skin. She didn't elaborate further. Jay asked her if she wanted to come around for a cup of coffee and the woman didn't say anything. At that point, Jay squinted into the dark hallway behind her and noticed the inside of the house was filled with statues, and that they seemed out of proportion and odd from what she could see. So, Jay left immediately, and then, that night, she heard odd noises, which she swore were footsteps. She said it sounded like somebody was running up and down her staircase, and she was paralyzed with fear. She lay awake all night and then packed a bag. She is now staying at a hotel and is planning to stay with her sons in Sydney for a while. After she hung up, I myself became incredibly paranoid and had a terrible night's sleep. I decided to tell G about this, so called him this morning before I went to work. He decided he was going to go over there, firstly to apologize to the woman. He saw a lot of comments which said what he did was silly and actually irresponsible, and was embarrassed about the way he handled things, and to tell her the truth about the real reason he was there, aka what happened all those years ago when we went to the house. He also thought he could find out information from her, and he said it sounded like she was in danger potentially, so it would probably be good to check up on her situation. Maybe she was living through what Carol went through. He said to me that he would probably be going there this afternoon unless he got called into work. At 4 today I got a missed call from him and so only saw it at around 4:30. I literally hate myself right now. I had a new voicemail from G. His voice was shaking, and all he said was, "Oh my freaking God, call me back right now. You are not going to believe what I just saw. I'm goddamn running right now, I'm coming over." I immediately called him back, no answer. I messaged him and texted him, no answer. I left work early pretending I was sick and immediately headed home, but he wasn't there and there was no sign that he'd been here. He hasn't been active on Facebook since 3 and his phone is now going straight to voicemail. So, I told A, and she isn't speaking to me because she thinks G and I have a thing now, and she's also really mad I've been investigating this house and not telling her after she said it was a bad idea. She also said I'm overreacting, and G is just a flaky guy whose phone probably died. I feel like a really shitty friend for not telling her about all of this. Finally, S is now involved. I sent her a message about an hour ago and we ended up talking on the phone. She told me something that shocked me. She went back to the house 2 years ago at night with her cousins. After telling them the story, they had begged and begged her to take them to it, despite the fact she'd had horrific nightmares and flashbacks almost every day since going there with us, to the point where she'd taken time off school. 2 years ago, her cousin begged her to take him there on his birthday, with a large group of his friends. She drove them but waited in the car while they went there. They saw that the house had been renovated and they didn't end up climbing over the fence. She said even though they hadn't gone in, when they came back they were all oddly quiet and seemed shaken. Apparently, all the lights were on, and there was what looked like a statue stationed at every window of the house, which they initially thought were people. Her cousin noted they were facing towards the inside of the house rather than outside. S said after that had happened she wanted to message us and talk about what happened that night but didn't want to relive the event. Right now, it's nearly 9 p.m. I've messaged G's brother and am waiting for a reply. I don't know whether to call the police. But when I write all this stuff out, it seems irrational, or all in our heads, and I feel like the police would not only not believe me, but possibly G could get in real trouble. I got a phone call from G. He, crying, said he was at his house, and he needed me to pick him up right now. Then he hung up. I had never heard G cry before, and I doubt he'd cried since he was a little kid. I immediately drove over to his place, and when I saw he was sitting on the ground across the road from his house, I knew something was terribly wrong. His car was also not there. As soon as he saw me he sprang up. He looked terrible, bloodshot eyes, white as a sheet. When we got to my house, he literally ran inside and locked the door and started pacing. I have written his account of what happened and why he called me as close to word for word as possible. 2 days ago, G decided, as I spoke about in my last post, to go back to the house. He was overly concerned after hearing Jay's story about Carol and actually felt worried about the new resident's safety. He also wanted, as I did, to see if he could apologize, get on her good side, and find out more about the house. He arrived at the house at roughly 3:30. He started walking towards the house, and through the front gate. Once he started approaching the front door, he became aware something was wrong. The front door was slightly open. He was disturbed to notice about 6 dead birds scattered across the lawn. Very, very apprehensively, he called out into the house, asking if anybody was home. This was when he heard what he described as a blood-curdling scream coming from inside the house. G, being G, against every instinct telling him not to go in, entered the house. As soon as he stepped inside, he was brought back to the night we explored the house in its abandoned state. The house was far, far too empty to be lived in, and yet it was. The whole bottom floor was empty, and every blind was down, rendering the house as dark as dusk. He was horrified to see the sheet-covered statues we had seen all those years ago were still there, motionless, in every room. He repeatedly called out hello, and are you okay, but there was no answer. He realized with dismay that the scream must have come from upstairs. Now, the whole upstairs area was quite different from when we explored the house originally. It was much smaller, G could tell from outside, but he still felt sick at the thought of ascending those unpleasantly familiar stairs. Shaking so much he could barely walk, he headed up. The first thing he noticed was it was stifling hot, to the point where he had to take off his jacket and tie it around his waist immediately. He called out again as he approached the top of the stairs and heard the scream again. He saw, with dismay, that none of the upstairs rooms had doors except the nursery, eerily echoing the abandoned house. There was nothing in any of the rooms except 4, bizarrely, stuffed animals, piles, and piles of them. Except they weren't animals he'd ever seen before. He said they were really weird and messed up and looked like something out of a weird French film he'd studied called Fantastic Planet, creepy, I discovered after Googling. He said that the cupboard that had the mural painted in it was still in one of the rooms but couldn't bring himself to check if the mural was still there. At this point, he was generally terrified. The nursery that was that night was still there, and the door was shut. G said when he approached it to turn the handle his hands were so sweaty he couldn't grip it. The door was unlocked, and with horror, G saw the room was exactly the same as it had been the night we originally explored it. He said it was unchanged, as though the renovators had bypassed the room completely, which seemed bizarre. There was also nobody visible in the room, though he was sure the sound had come from the nursery. He was about to step inside the room and towards the black crib when he heard that shrill, otherworldly scream, coming directly from the closed nursery cupboard. He immediately ran blindly back downstairs and out of the house. He had made it out of the house and was halfway to his car when he called me. When I didn't answer, he realized he should probably call an ambulance to the house in case the woman was hurt and had been the one screaming. So, he called 000 and told them he had heard screaming coming from inside the house. He gave them the address, and promptly hung up the phone, seeing the missed calls from me that I'd placed while he was on the phone to 000. At this point, he realized with horror that his jacket, in the pocket of which were his car keys and wallet, must have slipped from around his waist as he ran through the house. This was also the exact point when his phone died. He felt his only option would be to go back to the house, but as he walked back, he saw that a light was now on in the nursery. So, with none of his things, his only option was to take a bus to the station and then train back to his house as he was not going back in there. He decided to wait for the ambulance to arrive and stood in the cold for about half an hour. He hid as soon as he heard the sirens and watched as 2 paramedics exited the car and entered the house. He then waited, and waited and waited, getting colder, but the paramedics did not exit the house. He said he probably waited an hour before it began to get dark, and he was too cold and tried to stand there any longer. He realized at some point as he'd been zoning out the light in the nursery had been switched off. So, he left, and began the arduous journey on public transport home, in a state of anxiety over the fact the paramedics would find his ID in the house, and he'd probably be contacted to answer questions as to what he was doing there. He was also concerned that they had been in the house for so long. When G finally arrived home, he immediately plugged his phone into his charger in his room and then headed straight to the bathroom and had a shower. His roommate has been in Canada for 3 months, so he is currently living alone. He said as soon as got out of the shower, and walked back towards his room, he felt this overwhelming sensation of being watched, and every hair on his body stood up on end. He was almost in his room when he noticed what he was sure were bloodstains near to the front door. At this point, his heart just about stopped as he realized his address was on the license he left at the house. He grabbed his phone and took a photo of the blood and went to the kitchen to get some water before he planned to call a taxi to my house, hoping I would be able to pay the driver. When he reached the kitchen, he saw his work boots arranged oddly in the center. He immediately ran outside of the house, at which point he called me. He has stayed at mine the last 2 nights and is going to his parents tonight. At this point, G is planning to move out of his house and is going to stay with his parents until he finds somewhere new. He doesn't know what to do and neither do I in terms of calling the police or informing some kind of authority about this. He never was contacted by the paramedics or police about his ID in the house and the phone call he'd placed. We've both been monitoring the news and have heard nothing about the house or the woman or the paramedics. This will probably be my last post about this, as both G and I have resolved to have absolutely nothing more to do with this house and the investigation. All we can conclude is that something is deeply wrong there and that it is a place that should have remained abandoned. So, something very, very odd and disturbing happened. G and I decided to go back to his place today to clean it up so he could start taking photos to list the place online, after speaking to his roommate of course, and prepare to move the hell out as well as get some more of his stuff. So, at about 7, we were turning down his street when I saw somebody I recognized walking slowly on the other side of the road. It was Jay, unmistakably her. Now Jay had called me from a hotel almost a week ago telling me she, after hearing what sounded like a person running through her house at night, was going to stay with her sons in Sydney for a while. When I saw her, I honestly felt like I was tripping out and literally did a double take. G was like, what? He never saw Jay, and I told him without a doubt that was the neighbor I'd spoken to, who I hadn't spoken to about G's house or any recent events. So, G pulled over and we ducked down in our seats and watched as Jay slowly reached G's house, looked around, and then walked onto the property and around the side of the house. At this point, my heart was beating so hard because of what was she doing there. G looked at me and said, the only way she could possibly know where I live is if she had been in the house when I was there and gone through my wallet. Now, this just didn't seem right at all. Jay had been forthcoming with information and seemed genuinely scared on the phone when I last spoke to her. But it was definitely Jay, without a doubt, at G's house. We sat there for nearly an hour until finally, G poked me in the arm, and I saw her walk calmly out of the front door of G's house, and back the way she came. As soon as she was out of sight, G immediately got out of the car and approached the house. I really did not want to go in there but followed him anyway. The front door was locked as G had left it. When we got inside nothing was obviously wrong, and it was very unclear how she had inside as the back door was also locked. We searched the entire house and didn't find anything until I noticed something poking out from under the couch, which was really unsettling. Children, drawing, with what looked like weird stains on the back of it, pictured. It wasn't signed, dated, and didn't have anything written on it. G sent the pictures to his roommate who didn't recognize it or know anyone who could have drawn it. Now it may have been there the night G freaked out and got me to pick him up from his house, or Jay might have put it there. It was clear to both of us Jay was much more involved in this than she had let on, and maybe in a sinister way. Looking back at the photo of Jay visiting the Kennys at the hospital, there's a stuffed animal on the bed. G said that the stuffed animals he saw were a similar make to the yellow dog, sitting upright, except the animals were much more disturbing/unrecognizable. I have gone over and over my time at Jay's house. Her story seemed very sincere. There was nothing evident in her behavior that had indicated her involvement. G and I decided to investigate J, and this is where things get disturbing. G spent about an hour searching her address online trying to find the deed to her house/title holder and found that the property had been in the name of a woman called Carol Handler since 1968. There was no J*** listed and no husband. J had told me she and her husband had moved into that house in 1982. So, either J and her husband lived in a house owned by a woman called Carol, which is a huge coincidence with Carol Kenny, or J is actually named Carol Handler and lied to me about her name when she moved in, the fact she was married, probably the fact she has children. If J were actually Carol, she would have lived in the street before the house was built. Does that mean she lied about the names of the Kenny family/that whole story? G said something even looked off about J and the way she was walking and that the fact she was at his house means she must have been in the house. The only way to find out whether J was suspicious or not, G concluded, was to go back to her house and speak to her. So, we drove to her house. The first thing we noticed was that the house, the mansion, looked exactly as it had the last time G was there. No police tape, no sign anything had happened after the paramedics had gone in and not come out. The ambulance was gone, so clearly they had left. We walked up to J's house and knocked on the door. Her car wasn't there, and she didn't answer the door. So, G being G, he suggests we try and get in to look around. He has a death wish, I'm beginning to think. Now, I didn't want to do this at all, but I felt like we were close to the truth, the answers we needed. Plus, there were two of us, and G is a tall guy who could easily defend us if necessary. So, we walked around the back of her house and saw a small window was slightly open, in what turned out to be the bathroom, so I squeezed through and opened the back door, and we were in her house. It was strange, but something felt really off about the place even though I'd been there before. I had only seen the living room, but the bathroom and back of the house were very dark, all the blinds were drawn. G said this was eerily similar to the mansion when he went there last. We started to look around and I noticed there were no photos anywhere of the husband and sons J had spoken about. Oddly enough, there were also no mirrors in the house, even in the bathroom. The hall was blocked by two blows-up mattresses, under which were a door handle and a crumpled page from a magazine featuring Greek statues, which seemed to have had images cut out from it, pictured. Leading to a door with no handle, pictured, which turned out to be a pitch-black bedroom. At this point, the phone rang, and G and I froze. It went to voicemail, where a perky woman's voice could be heard. "Hi Carol, this is Laura calling you from Family Medical. In regard to your 2 p.m. appointment with Dr. Hui tomorrow, we've had a cancellation, and he is now available to see you 1:20 p.m. as you originally wished. Please call me back if you'd like a new appointment." G and I just looked at each other like holy crap. We decided we needed to get out of there. Just as we'd walked back through the house and were maybe 2 meters from the back door, we heard a key in the lock. G went into action mode and quickly opened the back door and dragged me outside whereas I just froze. We crouched behind the scrub near her back steps. She'd clearly heard something because we could hear her calling out hello. Something did, then, seem quite off about her voice. It was quite shrill and oddly toned. G went white at the sound of it. Both of us were shaking as we heard footsteps through the house approach the back. I closed my eyes at the point where I heard the back door open. She stood for maybe 5 minutes, during which I didn't breathe and neither did G nor then shut the door. "We have to get the hell out of here," G said as soon as she'd gone inside. "I swear to God that was the voice I heard in the house, that scream. I just know it was her," he said. So, we carefully stood and started to creep around the side of the house. We could see lights had been turned on inside, illuminating the blinds. Very odd considering it was a sunny day. When we made it to the side gate, it creaked loudly as we opened it, so G just grabbed my hand and we ran for it, not looking back once to see if she'd heard us and come outside. So now we're at mine, reeling from this. I just can't believe it. I don't really know what to think except. G wants to tell the police about this, but I really doubt they'll take our word, two young trespassers, over somebody who seems initially like a nice old lady.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.